Is up, everyone? It is Josh Butts here with no buts about it, here to talk about the Bengals' new offensive coordinator, Dan Pitcher. Now, of course, as we talked about earlier this week, the Bengals' offensive coordinator, or former offensive coordinator now, Brian Callahan, is the new head coach for the Tennessee Titans. If you haven't seen that video and want to watch that first, make sure to check out the link. I'll put that somewhere up here. I don't know where it'll appear, but it'll be up here. Go check that out. Now, if you're wondering who the heck Dan Pitcher is, like, where did this guy come from? He's a quarterback's coach. Okay, is he better than Cliff Kingsbury? Is he better than Joe Brady? Well, honestly, what Dan Pitcher is most well known for is in NFL media, he gets mistaken for Brian Callahan. And that happened a few times during Brian Callahan's interviews this year, most notably the Carolina Panthers. But that doesn't mean that Dan Pitcher isn't a great hire. I think this is a fantastic hire for the Cincinnati Bengals. So Dan Pitcher has been with two teams in the NFL in his NFL coaching career. He started with the Indianapolis Colts, which is actually my second favorite team, in 2012. So Andrew Luck's rookie year, he was an assistant scout, and then later on he got promoted to scout. He was the chief scout. And during that time, they drafted guys like Andrew Luck, obviously. They drafted T.Y. Hilton, Dwayne Allen, Jordan Werner, a lot of very promising guys who some didn't necessarily pan out, but a lot of them did, and that was a great era for the Indianapolis Colts, even if it didn't end super well. In 2016, Marvin Lewis brought Dan Pitcher over to Cincinnati from Indianapolis and brought him in as a Bengals assistant quarterback coach, and then he was eventually made the quarterback's coach under Zach Taylor. So he has been the quarterback's coach since 2020, which is when Joe Burrow came into the NFL. That means that Joe Burrow has never had a different quarterback's coach in his NFL career, which I think is very important to the consistency and very important to the relationship that he would have with Dan Pitcher as the offensive coordinator. In fact, Joe Burrow has said before the AFC Championship game that they have a great working relationship. He loves working with Dan Pitcher. Zach Taylor has talked about how Joe has been able to go to Dan Pitcher and vent if he needs to and just really trusts Dan, both game-wise and as a friend and as a coworker. It's a really great situation, and that's one of the main non-football reasons I'm very happy about this move. I think there's an honesty that's there, and if Dan is creating plays on the offense that Joe doesn't like or Joe doesn't think will work, Joe feels like he can go to Dan and be like, hey, I know, I get where you're coming from here, but we don't have the guys to do this, or this just isn't working for us. Can we try something else, or can we try a variation of this? And there's not this weird, like, kind of rift there might be if you bring someone in new. There won't be as much of a regression as there might be. And I get it. People want a flashy name. People want someone who they know can be an offensive coordinator. Guys like Cliff Kingsbury, guys like Joe Brady. But those hirings just really weren't going to happen, I don't think. Especially Joe Brady. I would be shocked if he leaves Buffalo. But we're talking about Cincinnati right now. And I really think that this relationship with Joe Burrow is the reason that Dan Pitcher was able to get this offensive coordinator job. It should also be noted, the Bengals weren't the only team looking at making Dan Pitcher an offensive coordinator. There were teams such as the Panthers, the Raiders, Patriots, and the Saints, all which Dan Pitcher had interviews lined up for. He was actively being pursued to be an offensive coordinator. And this is something that as Bengals fans, we are going to have to get used to, especially if this offense remains as dominant as it has been right now. We have to get used to our coordinators disappearing. Lou Anarumo was in head coaching discussions for a long time as the defensive coordinator, and there was regression this year, so he hasn't been there as much. We'll see what happens. There's also been a movement towards offensive-minded coaches, though. We've seen guys like Brandon Staley not pan out. Titans ended up moving away from Mike Vrabel, who's a defensive-minded coach, to go to Brian Callahan, an offensive-minded coach. So we'll see if that kind of pans out for them. Hopefully it does, because Brian deserves this chance. But Dan Pitcher was someone the league had taken note of, and Bengals fans shouldn't just wash him to the side so quickly like I've seen a lot of people do on Twitter. So aside from Joe Burrow's relationship with Dan Pitcher, what does Dan Pitcher bring to the table? Well, something that I think is really important is he was a scout. He has a background as an NFL scout, and as I mentioned, he was part of the team that drafted some really good players to the Indianapolis Colts. And that is important because if we're going to continue to have this dynasty offense and build around guys like Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, maybe even T. Higgins, if they consider him a foundational piece, we'll see. That is yet to be determined. But we're going to have to continue to hit on these rookie contracts. You can't continue to just extend people to huge contracts. You have to be able to hit on the rookie contracts on offense and defense. We've done fairly well on defense. There's a couple guys I'd like to see more out of, but we've done fairly well on defense, in my opinion. On offense, we may need some help. Chase Brown has been great. I don't know if Charlie Jones is going to pan out. Yoshi looks good, but in the trenches, we need to do a lot better. And we're going to need someone to fill in for Tyler Boyd, potentially Yoshi, potentially Charlie Jones. But if they don't work out, we're going to need someone else. We may need someone to fill in for T. Higgins as well. And then you're going to need a depth piece. You're going to want really good rookie young guys. And I think Dan Pitcher can help provide that. And now he will have a bigger say into what type of guys are going to be drafted onto the Cincinnati Bengals offense. And not only that, he can start writing schemes for these guys. He knows what the scheme will be, and he knows what kind of guys he wants for his schemes. Now, I have seen two super valid concerns when it comes to the Bengals hiring Dan Pitcher from within house, not going and getting someone from outside. And the first one is Zach Taylor is still calling the plays. He has not given up play calling yet. Bengals fans aren't huge on the way that Zach calls plays. And it's kind of hard to tell how much of the offense is Zach's and how much of it was Brian Callahan's. We know that Brian Callahan loves Shanahan-type offenses. They're very popular. He also seemed to really like wide zone offenses that just don't work for the Cincinnati Bengals, and we've seen the problems over and over again. Also, keeping Joe Burrow in shotgun all the time, that hasn't seemed to work. I wouldn't be shocked if we see Dan Pitcher move to more under center, and if we don't, that's going to be a problem that Zach Taylor will have to address, because I think even Joe is kind of like, why are we in shotgun the entire time? We don't need to be. Especially in run situations, because that kind of gives away that you're going to pass. But we'll see what happens. I am kind of hoping that Brian Callahan was the one trying to push the wide zone Shanahan-style offense, and that wasn't something that kind of Zach Taylor really wanted Brian Callahan to do, even though Brian Callahan was already a fan of it. And hopefully this relationship with Joe Burrow, Joe can kind of go to Dan Pitcher and say, stop, please. Just let's go under center. Let's do play action. Let's try something else. Run the ball more. These schemes, I think, are going to be a lot better and a lot more favorable to Joe. And hopefully we'll see more of Joe Mixon, more of Chase Brown, especially after the back half of the season that he had. The second issue is kind of the same thing, in my opinion. It's a little different, and that's just that we'll see the exact same playbook that Brian Callahan had. Basically, that the idea behind this fear is that Brian Callahan taught Dan Pitcher, so Dan Pitcher isn't going to come up with anything new, isn't going to come up with anything creative. This whole, I know I keep going back to it, but I think that is because this is the crux of the reason Dan Pitcher was hired. Dan Pitcher was hired to help Joe Burrow. And if Joe Burrow wants to be more innovative in a way, him and Dan Pitcher are going to find a way to do that. That relationship is going to become a hybrid. It's going to be very beautiful, I think, in the way that they come up with plays. We don't need to see more trick plays. That's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about just very basic quick passes in the middle, running the ball more, maybe a few deep shots. I want to see less screen passes. I would love to see a much more vertical offense, a offense that utilizes Jamar Chase, utilizes those passing weapons. When you have Joe Burrow out there, you don't have to constantly throw screen passes and go sideline to sideline. You can go across the middle of the field. He can make those throws. Dan Pitcher knows that. Dan Pitcher trusts his quarterback. He trusts Joe Burrow, and that is what is going to help the Cincinnati Bengals be successful on offense. This video isn't really anything new. We obviously don't have a lot to work with. We don't know what Dan Pitcher is going to end up bringing to the table, and we can analyze that later in the season. But right now, I'm just telling you why I love this Dan Pitcher signing, why I think it's so great. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and go do something nice for someone. Watching that video, guys. If you want to check out a most recent full episode of No Buts About It, that's going to be right over here. Yep, right there. Check that out. And if you just want to see more short clips, we're going to have one right over here for you to watch. Check out No Buts About It on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you listen to podcasts, so you can listen to us on the go. Once again, have a great day and go do something nice for someone.